Hi, my name is Charlotte Reed. I'm here at my studio at the Hellman Creative Center where I run my nonprofit business, Art Equals. Today we're going to be doing some fun creative projects that will give you an opportunity to find your own sense of artistic expression and hopefully learn something about yourself. So let's get busy. So labyrinths date back over 4,000 years. This picture here depicts the story of the Minotaur, which was plaguing the kingdom of King Minos. In order to keep the Minotaur from ravaging his kingdom, he built a labyrinth and put the Minotaur in the middle of the labyrinth so it couldn't get out. But unfortunately, the Minotaur was still a problem, and this picture here shows Theseus, the brave young soldier who was sent into the labyrinth to slay the Minotaur. His string that he is holding is what helped get him out of the labyrinth. So there's two types of labyrinths. There's a maze, which is seen here, which has winding paths and dead ends. And then there's a meander, which has one way into the center and one way out. A maze is often meant to confuse the traveler on the path of the labyrinth, but a meander is meant to just be a mindful walk and a pleasant walk. And that is what we're going to be looking at today. This is the classic Chartres labyrinth from the cathedral in Chartres, Paris. This labyrinth was inlaid in the floor of the cathedral and believed to be used for pilgrimages of the faithful. They would have walked this labyrinth and prayed their prayers and meditated on scripture and their faith. Many believe that people used the labyrinth for their pilgrimages instead of having to travel a far distance for a pilgrimage. We're lucky enough in Cincinnati to have our very own labyrinth in our backyard. If you travel down to Smale Park right on the river, you'll find this labyrinth. So take a trip down there sometime if you have the chance. This beautiful labyrinth sits on the river and can be easily accessed from the park. But we can't always have a labyrinth in our backyard, so finger labyrinths came about as a way to have a labyrinth to travel with. These are often small labyrinths that we can put in our lap or on a tabletop and trace with our finger. And that's what we're going to be making today. Finger labyrinths can be made out of all sorts of materials, from ceramic, wood, and today we'll be making one out of tissue paper, yarn, and glue. So let's get started. All right, so it's time to make the labyrinth. Let me talk about the materials you're going to need. First of all, you'll need some kind of board. This is a 12 by 12 canvas board that you can find at most art supply stores. It has a layer of canvas over a hard cardboard backing. If you can't get one of these, you could always use a piece of board that's laying around the house, but the directions are sized for 12 by 12. So if you're using something larger or smaller, you'll have to resize your pattern. You may want to coat your board with something that is waterproof because we're going to be using a lot of glue, and anything that is not coated with like a gesso or a spray that will keep water from getting into the cardboard may actually warp the board. So it's good to use these canvas boards. They're already gessoed and work really nicely. The next thing you'll need is your pattern. Now, because I'm working with a 12 by 12 space and most standard pieces of paper are 8.5 by 11, I had to print my pattern in two pieces, and then I'll have to actually cut the edge off and line them up, and I can cut around this and get it all ready, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Some other things you're going to need are some standard glue, 4 ounces should do. You'll need a container for water and glue. You'll need a brush, and this is just an inexpensive brush that you can get at a craft or even a hardware store. You don't need anything fancy because we're just using this for glue. You'll need some yarn or cord, and you want something that's going to be fairly thick. As you can see, my pattern, the lines are pretty thick, and we want to be able to cover most of the line. We don't want anything too huge, too thick, because we want to be able to keep that space in between the lines enough for our finger to move along the path. But a nice chunky yarn, probably about 1/8, no larger than 1/4 inch is good. And if you can find something that is pretty thick but not too fluffy, because if you get the yarn that's really fluffy, when it gets wet, it will actually kind of flatten out and be able to scrunch down. And so we want it to stay nice and thick. So a nice robust twine or a yarn that's pretty densely packed is really good. This is something I got in a kit and it works really great. Some other things that you may need are some scissors to cut your yarn. And then you're gonna need 2 layers of tissue. And let's talk a little bit about tissue. First of all, you're gonna need some colored layer. And I've got some what's called non-bleeding tissue paper. And that means that this tissue paper, when it gets wet, the color will not run off of it. Some art tissue papers are called bleeding tissue papers because artists like the color to move, you know, on whatever they're working on. So make sure that you get a non-bleeding tissue paper. And if you're getting tissue paper from like the dollar store or something like that, or you've got it left over from Christmas, that is generally non-bleeding tissue paper because it's not an artist tissue paper. So feel free to use whatever you've got left over from a birthday party. I'm always big on recycling stuff, but you want a couple of colors that will go together. And you can use one complete color, you can use multiple colors, but think about finding some colors that maybe make you feel nice and calm and relaxed, because this is all about being able to be mindful. The other thing that you'll need is a first layer, and I either like to use a white tissue paper. So again, you can raid the leftovers from your birthday present or your Christmas, that crumpled white tissue that you might have thrown away. Save that and it can be used. But you can also use other stuff like newspaper or wrappings from things. I actually have the wrapping from our toilet paper. So we get this nice eco-friendly toilet paper, and it comes wrapped in this nice thin strong paper, and I'm going to be using this, and I'll just tear that off to make my first layer to put over the string. A few other things that you might need or want to consider. I myself have a visual impairment, so sometimes it is difficult for me to see things. This is a pretty large pattern, so I'm able to see the lines. But if you were working with even less vision, or maybe you just have some difficulty seeing, have somebody help you with actually creating raised lines on your pattern. And you can do that by asking them to use, this is a fabric slick paint. And they can just go over the lines for you and let that dry, and then it'll create tactile lines that you can then use to figure out where the yarn is. And I like to do this sometimes on patterns that are smaller and a little bit more difficult for me to see. It allows me to use my hands, which is often act as my eyes, so that I can do things a little bit differently. So that's something to consider. The other thing you may want to consider, if you have any sensory aversions, if you don't like the touch of certain things, you may want to have a pair of gloves handy. We're going to be using glue and water and touching wet tissue paper. And if that is something that you don't like that sensation, or if even you don't like the sensation of the yarn on your fingers, use the gloves, and that will give you a barrier between those sensations in your hand, and it'll make it a lot more pleasant for you. So that's something to consider. Stop it. All right, so step one, you're going to glue your pattern down to the board. Now, as far as glue goes, you can either use your glue straight, and this will give you a nice kind of thick, sticky surface to work with, or you can get your glue ready for the next step and actually water it down a little bit. And that's what I've done here. I've poured my glue into this container and I've just added a little bit of water, enough that it's about the consistency of maybe thick cream. You can see that it's dripping off the brush. If this was straight out of the bottle, it would be a lot thicker. But I've just added enough water so that it's a little bit thinner. And when you're gluing your pattern down to your board, you want to make sure that you get it glued down really, really well. So I'm just going to coat my board, and I'm not going to worry about places where my pattern won't stick. I'm going to coat the areas where my pattern is going to go. And you can even trace around your pattern so you know exactly where it's going to go on the board. But I like to take a lot of shortcuts. So I'm going to put a nice layer of glue down. Make sure that that is well coated. I didn't miss any spots. And you can see I've taped my pattern together with the two pieces that I copied off the copier. And I'm going to just try and get that as close to the center as possible. And then I'm going to smooth that down. Now, one thing we're going to have to deal with is where the patterns overlap. And so I want to make sure that I get that glued down as well. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to put some glue on this bottom pattern. And I just had a piece of tape that was holding these two together. If you wanted to glue these together ahead of time so they were one solid piece, that would work as well. And just try and make sure that you get it as smooth out as possible. You don't want any bubbles or wrinkles. This is where an old credit card or even an old gift card that you already used would come in handy. You could just use the edge of that to scrape across and make sure that your pattern is sitting nicely on the edge. Now I've noticed that there's not glue over here. I want to make sure that all my edges are glued down. So I just put a little more glue there. Okay. And one thing you can do is go ahead and give this a nice coating of glue, and that will kind of help strengthen it, but this is not a necessary step. Just kind of helps me to know that everything is kind of glued down and I got those edges glued down. All right. Now we can let this dry, or we can go ahead and go on to the next step. So you could do this in stages. If you don't have time to do everything in one sit down, you can do the first part, come back later, do the second part. So now we're going to start putting the string on. And there's two ways to do the string. One is you can use the straight glue, and my string's going to tangle up here, of course. Okay, so we can use our straight glue and actually go along the lines and lay down some glue and then just begin to glue the string down just in its dry state. Or the other thing that you can do is you can kind of decide how much string we need ahead of time. So I'm going to kind of lay this against my line. And I think I'm going to go to about, well, let's see, I'm going to follow this whole path here. I'm going to go to right there. Okay, so I'm going to cut that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my string, my yarn, my paintbrush out of there, and this is where, if you don't like gooey things, put your gloves on, but I don't mind. This is non-toxic glue and water, so I know it's not going to be harmful. But I'm going to submerge my string and get it nice and wet, and get that glue kind of all throughout it. And then as I'm pulling the string out, I'm just using my other finger to kind of get some of that excess glue off. And then I will use this to set down on my pattern. And it's kind of like working with spaghetti. You're going to have to be careful until it dries to not bump it, because otherwise it's going to want to move on you. But just try and lay it down on that line. And the reason this works really well is because when this dries, it'll be nice and stiff, and it'll give you a nice firm wall. And so when we do the next step with the tissue paper, it'll make it so that you don't have to do as many layers of tissue paper. Okay, so I've actually overestimated, so I'll just go back and cut that a little bit. And I probably, now I realize that I have missed, where is my opening? You want to make sure that you don't cover any of your openings. So just stay on the line. Okay, you want to go ahead and cut?
Sure.
So this particular pattern is problematic because for some reason. Okay, so I went ahead and fixed the fact that I had covered the opening and made sure that everything is covered and that all my pathways are open. And now I'm ready to do the next part, which is to cover this up. I want to cover the string and the pattern so that we have these nice walls and kind of a solid labyrinth. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our brush, put a little glue down, and then take our tissue, put that over top. And again, this is another part where if you don't like the sensation of gooey, wet paper, grab those gloves, because you're going to get your fingers quite gluey. And you can see that I'm putting this paper down. I'm putting some glue down, putting the paper over, and then I'm putting more glue on top, and then I'm making sure to smooth with my finger because I want to make sure that that paper gets up against the yarn and covers it, but also leaves my pathway nice and open. And remember that this layer is simply here to cover up the yarn and the pattern itself. And so if it's not really the color that you want, that's okay, because we're going to cover this with the colored tissue paper. If you decide you don't want to use colored tissue paper, the other thing you can use once you've got this all covered is you can use some acrylic paint. And that's also nice because then you could do some designs. I've seen people that actually paint the track of the labyrinth, maybe a rainbow color. So it goes from red to orange to yellow, so on and so forth. So as you progress through the path, you get different colors, which is kind of nice. And that's where your own creative expression is going to come in. So when you're all finished with the first layer, it'll look something like this. I've actually gone over mine with a little bit of white paint to cover over some of the colors. But then you'll go to the next layer where you will add your colored tissue paper. I've sped these up just to save some time today. So we're all finished with the labyrinth. We've decorated it with the tissue paper. I chose to kind of leave some of my dark colors on this side and my light colors on this side. And you want to make sure that once this is all dry that you run your fingers across it and feel for any places where maybe the paper has come up, and you can glue those back down. You can also take a little piece of sandpaper and actually go through and sand any rough spots, and then you can put a little bit of glue over top of that to smooth it down. If you find any places where your paper wants to give a little bit because your yarn underneath is a little bit squishy still, you can just add some more layers of tissue paper. Just make sure that you don't add too many that your tracks become too narrow for your finger to go through. So now we're going to actually use the labyrinth. What we want to do is get in a comfortable space. Maybe sit in a comfortable chair, put this on top of a desk or in your lap. Make sure that you're comfortable, because this is all about relaxing and being calm and mindful. And mindful is simply just a state of being present, not worrying about what's going to happen in the next moment or tomorrow, not worrying about what's happened in the past or yesterday. It's just about being present. And sometimes that can be a little bit difficult because we've got so many things going on. And so one of the ways that we can help ourselves be present in the moment is to really engage our senses. So touch, taste, sight, sound. So our brains can only take in so much information at a time. And so when we use our senses, it's information input, and it often means that we can't worry ourselves about other things, like things that have happened in the past or things that are happening in the future. We can only be present in the moment. So we're going to concentrate on those senses today. Let's take a deep breath in and out. Put your finger at the beginning of the labyrinth, and we're going to just concentrate on relaxing our bodies, clearing our minds as best as we can. And if something comes into your mind, that's okay. You can think about it for a second, but then concentrate on your finger and how it feels moving along that labyrinth. Is it smooth? Is it rough? So let's get started walking down the labyrinth path. As you move through the labyrinth, just allow your eyes to relax. You can even close your eyes if you like. You can do what's called softening your gaze, where you maybe rest your eyes so that they slightly close, and allow your finger to follow along that path. Think to yourself, how does my finger feel? What is it feeling? What's the temperature of the surface? Is it smooth? When I bump up against the wall of the labyrinth, is it smooth or rough? And just slowly make your way through the labyrinth. You may notice as you go through the labyrinth that you will find yourself trying to predict which way your finger is going to turn. And that's all part of being present. You're sensing, you're trying to think, but you're actually having to rely on what your senses are telling you as you go through the labyrinth. Which way will you turn next? Which direction will you go? Eventually, you will come into the middle of the labyrinth, and here you can pause, or you can trace your way right back out and begin to go back through the labyrinth. Some people actually do like to pause in the center and take another deep breath. But if you've gone on through the labyrinth like I have, just continue. And again, enjoy that sensation of letting your finger slide along the pathway. You may find yourself feeling familiar spots. And the more you do this, you actually start to remember which way to turn and which way to go. So now you've reached the end of the labyrinth. If you'd like, take another turn around the labyrinth. Maybe you'd like to relax a little bit more. I'm going to continue moving my fingers through the labyrinth, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how you can continue to use this on your own and share this with others. You can do this on a daily basis to kind of give yourself some time to relax. And science has told us that just taking a few minutes every day to relax and do a little deep breathing is really good for our bodies and our brains. So maybe when you come home from school or you're done with a particularly big task, you can take a few minutes and relax. You'll see that I've moved into the middle of my labyrinth and I've paused here and I'm taking a nice deep breath before I continue back out. And this is a good practice to get into because it gives you a moment to pause and again, concentrate on that breathing, which is a really good thing for our bodies to get oxygen in. I hope you've enjoyed working with me today, and I hope you will find a lot of uses for your labyrinths and continue to use them and maybe even explore making another one with different colors and sharing them with a friend. If you have any other questions or comments, you can feel free to contact me at info@art-equals.org, and I'd love to see pictures or hear from you. Thanks again.